And welcome everyone to our celebration of the 20th anniversary of the equalisation of the age of consent. And it's lovely to see so many familiar faces from the campaign here tonight. I'm Hugo Greenhalgh, editor of Openly, the LGBT plus news website from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is the charitable arm of Reuters. And for those of you who know me, you'll probably know that tonight represents the perfect mix of the professional and the personal. But first, I'd just like to say I'm incredibly grateful to Doughty Street Chambers for inviting Openly to be the media partner for tonight's event. Jonathan Cooper at Doughty Street, who you'll hear from a little later, and I have been talking about marking this date for some months, so it's great to join you all here tonight, if unfortunately not quite in person. But let's start with that professional bit first. When I first joined the Thomson Reuters Foundation and helped launch Openly in 2018, it felt as if I was coming home somehow. Having spent more than 20 years as a financial journalist, most of which at the Financial Times, to be able to write about those issues with my colleagues on the Openly team, Rachel Savage, Matt Levitas, Cormac O'Brien and Katie McGarrow, to write about those issues that have a direct impact on the lives of LGBT plus people around the world was incredibly important. And as we look back this evening, it's also critical that we keep a keen eye on those issues affecting LGBT plus people today. Around the world, LGBT plus lives are still under threat. For example, last year Openly broke the story of Brunei introducing the death penalty for gay sex and brought a wider focus on Uganda, which was also thinking of introducing a similar measure at that point. Many of the issues we faced as the queer community back then are now faced by trans people, not only in the UK, but around the world as well. But one thing to stress, at Openly, we are journalists, not advocates, not activists, but journalists, making sure we offer impartial news to a world that often isn't. And back to the personal bit here, I started off as an activist, not quite out of university and aged just 19. In 1993, I and my then boyfriend, Will Parry, who also you'll hear from later this evening, and Ralph Wilde took the British government to the European Court rather, of Human Rights over the gay male age of consent, which was then 21 to the straight 16. I'll let the others speaking tonight go into the detail of that campaign, but to stick to the personal, I'd also like to dedicate this little kind of mini speech to my father, Steve, who died several years ago. And I think his wife, Angie, and my brother, Jack, are watching this evening. Steve was an ardent supporter, whether it be coming on pride marches with me or sitting in the royal box at the Albert Hall for a Stonewall Gala. And yes, he rather loved that bit, bless him. But when I first came out to him, aged 15, he wasn't immediately comfortable having a gay son. But by the end of the campaign, he was the strongest ally and the best dad you could ever wish for. And that, for me, was the point of the campaign. We might not have achieved equality on that incredibly emotional night of February 1994 when Parliament fudged at 18, but we won the moral argument hands down. And I really think the campaign and those of earlier and later helped to shift the culture in this country. And that, for me, is what I'd like to celebrate tonight in particular. So thank you all again for coming, and a huge thank you to our speakers, Edwina Curry, Angela Mason, Peter Tatchell, Chris Smith, Naomi Wolf, Ewan Sutherland, and Will Parry, Tony Blair, and our chair for this evening, Elena Kennedy. So crack open the baby sham and mix those martinis, and it's going to be a fabulous, and I suspect for me and others, quite an emotional evening. And now I shall pass the metaphorical microphone to our chair, author, broadcaster, and leading human rights expert, Baroness Kennedy, who will guide you through this evening. Thank you all again for coming.
Hugo, it's really wonderful that that you've opened our event and that you and Jonathan Cooper from Doughty Street Chambers were the initiators really of this event, because you together had been talking about how important it had been to make this change, and really it was a sort of, if you like, a seminal event because it led very speedily to a shift in culture. When you think of what's happened over the last 20 years, and it's really a source of celebration. Now, there was a blight on that great horizon, I have to tell you, which was that complaint came through because an invitation had been extended to different people who'd played their parts right and left. Edwina, a conservative, Tony Blair, who was a prime minister, who made this change in legislation one of his key commitments, and was part of his manifesto. And so the idea had been to bring together people who had either personally been involved in playing a part, who had done it in Parliament in their different ways and on the different sides of the political spectrum, how that had played out. And unfortunately, it has led to a small storm. I wouldn't suggest it's a big storm. I certainly have received communications, and some part of the LGBTI community have really found it a hard thing to swallow that we've invited Tony Blair, because they opposed Tony Blair's position on the Iraq war. But I think that they also would say that when it came to other parts, that we mustn't live in silos, that when it comes to other parts of his period in office, that his Home Secretaries, for example, had immigration policies which were sometimes really hostile to gay rights, because there's the example of people who were deported, who had come and who were living in this country, or who were deported back to the Caribbean, where what happens, and I can tell you this from my own work in this field, what happens to members of the gay community and the trans community is horrifying, and they're facing murder and persecution, and also the failure to give asylum to people who have been fleeing persecution in parts of the world. So the policies inside the Home Office in the different governments that have been Labour, the coalition government, and the Conservative government since, that hostility, that hostile environment had led to real failures in relation to the gay community too. So they're not feeling happy about the invitation that was extended to Tony Blair. Now, there are others who are conspiracy theorists who seem to think that it's got something to do with the fact that Keir Starmer, who leads the Labour Party and is the leader of the opposition, that this is some great conspiracy of, I don't know, pink washing Tony Blair's record. I have no idea, but all I can tell you is that if there's a conspiracy, I'm not in on it. I don't think any of us are. I want to just say, though, that I am someone who is, I really feel very strongly that no platforming, this whole business of cancelling people is unacceptable. That, here we are facing a rise in populism around the world. I'm running an Institute of Human Rights that's global for the International Bar Association. And the ways in which human rights are being undermined is horrifying. And once you start interfering with freedom of speech and freedom, we really have to hold the line and hold the standard. Now, there are times when we, of course, disagree with each other. And disagree profoundly. I apparently have the record for having voted against Labour in government as a Labour peer more times than anybody else. I did that because I didn't agree and I stood on principle. But I honestly believe that the best way always is in sharing information, exchanges of ideas, arguing the toss, and trying to persuade people why they've got it wrong. Now, and so Tony Blair is participating in this event, and he does so, and he's going to now, by the short video that he made for us, he played a pivotal role in this change, and I welcome his attendance. Tony Blair.
It's incredible to think that it's 20 years since the passing of the equalisation of the age of consent legislation in the House of Commons during the early years of my government. I remember back in the 1980s and 1990s when, at that time, with some notable exceptions like Edwina Currie, but many of the Conservative Party were campaigning on an anti-gay rights platform. And it was conceived of as a point of weakness or difficulty for the Labour Party. But we took a position for our manifesto. I'd spoken myself on the issue several times as an opposition frontbencher. And I was determined when we came to office that we would do it. But as our battle over the age of consent showed, it wasn't easy. We had quite a large number of constituencies lined up against us. We found the House of Lords implacably opposed, not all of them, of course. Many of them sided with us. But in the end, we then had a crucial choice towards the end of November 2000. Did we use the Parliament Act or not? And I remember at the time, there were many people who were very doubtful we should do it. A lot of people who expressed to me privately that we would lose a lot of political capital if we did it. And I remember having a conversation saying, well, what's the point of having the political capital if you're not prepared to use it in pursuit of something you genuinely believe in? So we did it. We used the Parliament Act. And so the age of consent was equalized. And that was part of a whole litany of similar types of legislation or action that we took, allowing same-sex couples to adopt, making discrimination against LGBT an offence, ensuring that the ban on lesbian and gay people in our armed forces was lifted, making acts of violence against gay people a hate crime, so that it could be penalized in a more tough way by the criminal justice system, and of course the Civil Partnerships Act, and many, many more measures, the repeal of Section 28. And throughout it all, I learned two things that I think are important. The first is that back in the 1980s and 1990s, when Labour was losing elections, we lost 4 in a row, the Conservatives built a coalition. And part of that coalition were people who took very, very traditional and often prejudiced positions on issues like the family and LGBT and so on. And I realized at the time that there was a section of people who might vote Conservative for reasons to do with the economy or enterprise. Maybe they distrusted Labour because of the last time it was in power. But these people were essentially socially liberal. They didn't want to have a country where prejudice stood in the way of progress. So this was important to me because it helped us build a new coalition of people who wanted a strong economy, social justice, an enterprising private sector, but were socially liberal, who recognized that in today's world, to discriminate against people for whatever reason is not just something that is morally wrong, it's extraordinarily foolish because you waste so much talent and you hold back so much potential, as well as blighting so many people's lives. So it was important for that reason. But it also taught me something else. As well as being an important part of the political coalition that allowed us to win power and keep us in power, it was important for another reason. It taught me that when you meet a wall of prejudice, as we did over the age of consent, and you look at it, and you've been contemplating it for a long time, and many people will tell you that that wall is thick and deep and hard to dislodge. The fascinating thing is that if you move with determined speed to demolish it, it crumbles much more easily than you ever anticipated. And that is actually what happened. And one of the greatest achievements that I'm most proud of with my government is not simply the fact that we did all of this, but that we did it with support from enlightened conservatives and with the Conservative Party itself in time changing its position so that this is part of the national consensus that we have as a country today. That for me is really, really important, because the true test of changes that you make is not simply that you're able to make them at a particular moment in time, but that they go on to last and endure for all time because they become part of a new political disposition. So that's why I think it's important to celebrate this 20th anniversary. Important because of the issue in itself, important for what it means, and important for what it tells us about our own country. That despite all the difficulties and all the bigotry and prejudice that we can see, actually, this was something that was won with difficulty, but is now secure in the politics of our nation. That is the thing I am most proud of. So I offer my congratulations to everybody who's celebrating this great anniversary. I look back on this moment in time in November 2000 as one of my proudest moments in politics. Thank you.
So there was Tony Blair's statement that he wanted to make, and undoubtedly it made a huge difference that that legislation was passed, that was contained within the Labour manifesto, and that those changes led to so many other changes, that the culture has shifted, that it led in turn to, I think, what happened in Ireland too, with regard to gay rights. Those things really, sometimes it just takes something to turn something around, and I think that moment was important. And for many people who are not my great age, you might not know that the Section 28, the poison that was created by that, where people were teachers in schools, where young people were being bullied and abused, and if they turned to a teacher to explain what was happening to them, that teachers were not allowed to comfort them and to tell them that it was not they who were at fault, it was bullies who were at fault, because that was promoting homosexuality. It was a nonsense, and it was terrible, and it really was something that was horrifying in the lives of so many people. And the cases that I did back in the 70s and 80s through into the 90s for people in the gay community taught me so much about how vile hatred is, and so if this is one thing that Tony Blair can feel proud about, then he should feel proud about it, because it was an achievement. When we come to talking about the Iraq War, we can have a different discussion. But on this particular thing, it made a huge difference. So I want to draw on my next guest's experience. It's Edwina Curry, and Edwina, a reference was made to you by Tony Blair in his speech, and he was saying how important you were in creating the change, that you were an ally in all of this, but you were in cold company. There weren't many people in your own party who were providing you with sustenance and support when you were taking this position on behalf of the gay community. Can I ask Edwina to join us?
Thank you very much, Helena. It's a pleasure and a real honour to be here with you all tonight. For me, really, the story started in 1992, when we'd had a general election. I'd held on to my seat. I turned down the chance to become a government minister in a junior post again. And I thought, right, I'm going to use my time as a backbencher as well as I can. And I attended a meeting in room 14 on the committee corridor of something called TORCH, the Tory Campaign for Homosexual Equality. And I thought, yeah, I'd see if there's 2 or 3 people in there. And I got in there and it was heaving. And everybody that came in did exactly the same thing, sort of peek around the door and see if they were going to be on their own. And it was being led by Steve Norris, by Robin Squire, and by Sir John Wheeler, who all felt, as I did, that we had to get rid of Clause 28, and it was an important thing to do it from the back benches, because that's how Clause 28 had come into legislation in the first place. And the slight problem that they had was I may have turned down a ministerial job, but Steve, Robin and Sir John all very quickly were persuaded to accept them in the new government. And suddenly I'm the most senior ex-ministerial person there, and everybody's looking at me and saying, Edwina, will you do this? And I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe it really shouldn't be me. Maybe it should be a man. And the answer was, no, you'd be perfect, because you're a married woman with 2 daughters So nobody can say you're doing it for yourself. Right, off you go. And the issue, in a sense, was forced for me by another member of Parliament who also remembers it with great affection, and that's John Nicholson, who is now a member for the SNP, because he was working for the BBC at the time as a presenter, and he dragged me off to Amsterdam to make a BBC documentary about gay life in Amsterdam. How about that? The main thing I remember, it was raining most of the time, and we visited some of the livelier gay clubs when they were empty. But it meant that I had to start expressing exactly how I felt. And it was all about discrimination. If you were a woman in the House of Commons in those years, you knew what discrimination was about. If you came from the north of England, you knew what discrimination was about. And I'm a Scouser. If you were Jewish, you knew what discrimination was about. And I hate discrimination in all forms. But if you're going to challenge prejudice, I realized you have to understand it. And so we started to do a lot of work. And by we, I mean people on all sides of the House of Commons. We knew very quickly that we wanted to do the age of consent. It's much more important than what is taught in schools. The age of consent is about personal liberty, personal choices. And I knew that we could make that argument in such a way that it would appeal very widely. And on the whole, Tories don't like normally, perhaps not in COVID year, but normally they don't like making laws telling people what to do. There's a libertarian argument there that one could touch on. And in order to do this, I needed quite a lot of support. The obvious thing to do was have it as an all-party debate, and to have it as an amendment to a piece of government legislation, the Criminal Justice Act. And that meant that the government had to make time for it, and that we could organise it properly. It wasn't just going to get lost on a Friday amongst other private members' bills. And I immediately said, well, I need a top Labour name as a seconder, and it has to be a backbencher. And they said, who do you want? And I said, Neil Kinnock. And they said, you can't have him, he won't do it. Said, why won't he do it? Well, he's a Welshman. And he has 2 sons. He's not going to do it. I said, you ask him. You tell him from me. He believes in equality. Let's go and talk about it. So Neil and I sat down over rock cakes in St. Ermin's Hotel, and we talked it through. And bless him, he was marvellous, absolutely marvellous. And actually, when he spoke, it was better that it came from that background. And he was able to say, I've faced my prejudices. Everybody should do that. And if you're going to face prejudice and talk it through, sometimes you need to understand the pain that's behind that. I remember having a conversation with a Tory colleague in one of the corridors, and he said, Edwina, you don't understand what you are asking when you want us to vote for this. And I said, go on, tell me. And he said, you did not go to prep school, to boarding school at the age of 7. That's what you're asking for. And of course I didn't. And I had no idea that that kind of connection was going to be made. And that was part of the tragedy of it, that the whole issue was wrapped up with AIDS. It was wrapped up with promiscuity, as the visit to Amsterdam showed. And deep down in the dark recesses of some people's tragic experiences, it was wrapped up with paedophilia. And it was really very important that we just raise it up to the level of, these aren't gay rights, these are human rights. These are human rights. And people have the right and should have the right to determine what they want to do as freely as possible in a free society. Now, the debate actually took place in February of 1994. That's widely available. And I have to thank Edmund Burke, the great 18th and 18th century thinker, because there was one point at which Tony Marlowe asked me a really offensive, nasty question, should have been ruled out of order. And then he said, do our constituents want us to vote for that? And Edmund Burke sitting on my shoulder, and he gave me the answer, and he said, our constituents send us to this house. Well, he actually said with their consciences, with our consciences, we should use our consciences. But what I did as I said, our constituents send us to this house, my tone dripping with contempt, with our brains intact, and they expect us to use them. I am quite proud of that. Now, what we did achieve was not to get equality. We got 18 with a huge majority. And in fact, lots of Tories voted with us and quite a lot abstained. There was quite a lot of Labour MPs who didn't vote with us, and some who voted against, like David Blunkett and Ann Taylor, particularly if they were Catholic or they represented deeply conservative with a small c constituencies, particularly in the north of England. But what we were able to do was change opinion. Suddenly it was only a matter of time. It was only a matter of time. Sooner or later, we were able, I think, to encourage far more people to come out, to talk to their families, to go and be willing to talk about it, not to hide it. We were able, I think, to give more confidence and more protection to many millions of people, wide range of people from all sorts of backgrounds. It really was an incentive. And boy, it felt good. And it was a lot of fun to do. I think politics should be fun. It was a lot of fun to do. When I came into the corridor next to my office the next morning, I couldn't get in for flowers everywhere. I had 1,000 letters in the 3 days flat. It took me ages to reply to them all. We couldn't try again in that parliament because there was a convention that big social issues or big issues that were cross-party or free votes, like age of consent, like capital punishment, like abortion, you could only do them once in a parliament. If you lost it, you had to wait till after a general election. And thereby we handed on the baton and other people went with it. But I'm really glad we did it. Really, really glad. I made lots of friends. I learned a lot. I had a lot of fun. And I think in the end, we changed the world in a small way. And you can't say better than that.
Edwina, thank you so much. Now, it's very interesting. There are lots and lots of things coming up on the side in the chat and in the question and answer, and they're all basically indicating an anger and distress that any decent set of chambers or any decent folk would participate in a debate that Tony Blair was taking part in because they see him as a war criminal. It's interesting that many of them are anonymous. And I'm not going to give credence to people who enter into a discussion and who are not prepared to put their name to it. One of the people, David Kelly, someone called David Kelly, is at least expressing himself openly and with vehemence about his disgust at Tony Blair and about the many dead in Iraq. We're not discussing the Iraq war tonight. This is not what we're here to discuss. I want us to have the opportunity where the gay community and the trans community can celebrate some of the gains that have been made, but the fears that they have about a backlash, because you can be sure that none of these gains are set in stone and it can all go backwards. And so that is what tonight is about. Please take your objections elsewhere. You've expressed them. We understand them. We hear them. But this is not the night for them. This is a night for looking at the gains that have been made for people who have really had their rights taken away, the gains that have been made, and that they must be protected as we go forward. So I'm now going to, there's one question that was asked of you, Edwina,
yeah,
and you've seen it. And it's saying basically that there was a quote from you in 1986 where you said that good Christian people who wouldn't dream of misbehaving will not catch AIDS. Did you say this shocking thing?
Well, let me put it immediately into context. The first thing is you have to hear a voice that's dripping with sarcasm. All right. Mm-hmm. I was on the AIDS team as a junior health minister. And indeed, one of the things that we were promoting was more information. People didn't know at the time, but the government gave quite a lot of money to the Terence Higgins Trust, because we knew if the government was talking to some people in the gay community, they wouldn't take any notice. But if the Terence Higgins Trust was doing it, they would. And we were talking about gay, safe sex and really tried to widen knowledge so that people should not get infected. At the time, there was no kind of cure or treatment, as everyone will remember. People were dying all around us like flies. It was just awful. But there were lots of objections to what the government was doing. And amongst those were coming from what we would describe now as the evangelical wing of Christianity. And I should say my daughter is now, she was a little girl then, but she is now a member, and I respect their views. I just don't agree with them. And I was picketed when I went on a visit to a mother and baby clinic. I was picketed by the We Frees, the Presbyterians. I went to a mother and baby clinic where people were trying to avoid getting infected through needle exchange and so on. And they thought I was wrong. And so my response to this, quite sarcastically, was, well, you know, they don't have to worry about it. Because good Christians, i.e. them, if they don't misbehave, they're not going to get AIDS, are they? And what I was really saying was, you know, they're entitled to their views, but what we're about is something that they should be supporting. What we are about is trying to widen, well, is trying to look after people's health. And I was really calling some of these people out as hypocrites.
Of course. I mean, sometimes that's one of the problems, is that sometimes sarcasm or irony doesn't translate well when it's put in print, and then when it's taken out of context and then it's dragged out of history, then it can be used in any way that people might want. There's a lovely message on the side here from Keelan Gallagher, a very distinguished Queen's Counsel, saying thank you to Edwina Currie for a very moving and powerful speech. Not a question, but a tribute. And so there we are. Edwina also exposed the blood product scandal in the early 80s, famously pointing out that the blood supply was at risk. So, you know, you've taken up things on behalf of people over the years, and often not popular with your own side of debates. Anyway, I'm really grateful to you for giving us time tonight and coming and telling us that piece of history, and it was really valuable. I'm very good to see you, Edwina. Thank you for coming. I know you
Take care, everyone. Stay safe out there.
Okay, you take care too. Bye-bye. Now, Angela Mason is with us. Angela Mason is known to anybody who's ever been involved in done cases involving gay rights, the gay community, the persecution of gay people, discrimination against gay people, and so on. And she has been an incredible voice in this field, and of course was really played a very important role at Stonewall, but also a very important role in government, and because she was a policy advisor. Angela, over to you, and you can talk us through the great moment of change.
Thank you very much, Helena. And isn't it interesting how we always have controversy amongst us? I think it was actually ever thus. And hi, everybody. It's lovely to see you. We're all here. Really, really nice to see everybody. I hadn't realised it was the 20th anniversary of the age of consent. I didn't know the lesbian, gay, transgender movement was old enough to have these sort of anniversaries. I guess that's time passing on. When I was thinking of what to say, I fished out a slim pamphlet that I wrote in September 1993. And I hope people can see it. It's called The Case for Change. And at the top, you will see inset a picture, a photograph of Will and Hugo and Ralph Wilde. And we had just, Ralph, Will and Hugo had just started their case in the European Court of Human Rights. And we were just starting our campaign for an equal age of consent. And Ralph, Will and Hugo at that time were really the face of the campaign, and very charming faces they were too. And I think because of that sort of personal identification, the arguments that we were making were very much more powerful. But at the risk of quoting myself, I'm just going to read a tiny little bit from the pamphlet, because it wasn't just what we were campaigning for wasn't just an equal age of consent. It was, in a sense, our sort of civil rights moment where we were coming out in society. And I said, in 1967, homosexuality was made semi-legal. The price of this reform was what is now the highest age of consent for gay men in Europe. In 1967, homosexuality could only be tolerated if it was hidden away. That's obviously a reference to sexual reform in 67. It was something to be ashamed of. Reforming the criminal law will not only challenge discrimination, it will help redefine the public status of homosexuality. It will be part of the process which enables lesbian and gay men to take our place within society. And that's what really, I think, made the campaign for an equal age of consent so important. It was very interesting how Ralph, Will, and Hugo came to take the case. I don't know if you remember, but how we found you was by advertising in the gay press. And you all said you wanted to take a case. And I believe I interviewed you all in the tiny little offices in Greycoat Place. And I think we initially found Ralph. And of course, partly because he was called Ralph Wilde, it was very tempting to have a case called Wilde against the UK, a sort of Oscar bashes back. But Will and Hugo also asked, and you were so charming and so persuasive. And I think we thought at the time that it would be useful to have a gay couple, that we took you on board. You came on board as well. So that was how that started. So the pamphlet is partly about their case, but at the back, there's loads and loads of stuff about how to lobby your MP. It's called Stonewall Lobbying Tips, and they're terribly earnest. It says, Beginner's Guide to Lobbying, how MPs judge opinion in their constituency helps direct their voting behaviour. They want to know who supports an issue, how many support the issue, why they support it, etc., etc. And every contact you make is an important one. It's one more voice for lesbian and gay equality. Make your voice count. And what we were really doing is directing a mass campaign, a mass coming out campaign to Parliament, which I don't think had ever been done before. And I remember talking to, excuse me, Roy Hattersley, who was a Labour MP at the time. And he said to me, you're going on about the age of consent, but I've never had a single letter. And I just said to him, you will. And thousands, literally thousands of people wrote letters, and they weren't pro forma letters. I think any MP, pity Edwina's gone now, but any MP would testify. They were very sort of personal, detailed, moving letters that people wrote and in support of the campaign. And of course, the groundwork had been laid, in a sense, by previous gay campaigns, particularly the Gay Liberation Front, which celebrated its 50th anniversary this October. And I know Peter, who's here, was going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first demonstration that the Gay Liberation Front organised. But the theme of the Gay Liberation Front was to come out and be proud of being gay. So that had an enormous influence. And the other factor was, of course, the passing of Section 28, which really angered the lesbian and gay community and drew all sorts of new people into the struggle, like particularly Ian McKellen and Michael Cashman, who set up Stonewall. I'm going to talk a little bit about the campaign, but before that, I just wanted to say one or two points about the legal cases, because they were very important indeed. Although, ironically, we never had a full hearing. We only had hearings and comments on admissibility. And Hugo and Will and Ralph's case, the court asked us to comment on admissibility just at the time that Edwina was preparing to move her amendment. And I think it was quite clear that the court was looking very sympathetically on the facts of that case. But after we failed to get equality, we got a reduction to 18, as Edwina explained. Ewan had been involved in that campaign, and Ewan agreed to take his case. And there was actually a hearing on admissibility on Ewan's case. And Ewan, we went over to Strasbourg, and we all stayed in a small hotel. And we spent a whole day with Peter Duffy writing speeches. I think in the end, Ewan and I had to go out. We couldn't go out to dinner because we couldn't take it any longer. But anyway, there was this important hearing on admissibility with David Panic actually at that time on the other side. And the two important points that arose from that, and I think really were quite groundbreaking, was firstly that the court found that, emphasized again that the convention was a living instrument that one had to look at changes that had happened in society, and in particular in the facts of this case, the fact that 21 Council of Europe countries out of 28 did have an equal age of consent. And the other major breakthrough was that they found that discrimination on grounds of homosexuality could be a breach of Article 14 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which dealt with discrimination. So that was an enormous breakthrough because it basically meant that gay rights could be human rights. So the cases were extremely important, but we were then asked, after Ewan's case on admissibility was found in our favour, whether we were asked by the government, by Tony Blair's government, whether we would stay the case so that they could bring forward legislation in Parliament. And we did agree to do this. And people have criticised that, and I think criticism can be made. But the reason we agreed to do this was because we felt that if the law could change in Parliament, that gave it a more profound legitimacy than just the judgment of the European Court. And that's why when Labour came to power, they then, as Tony Blair explained, they then put forward new efforts, new legislation to equalise the age of consent, which were all knocked back by the House of Lords, particularly by Janet Young in the House of Lords, and eventually the Labour government had to use the Parliament Act to introduce an equal age of consent. The legal battle on the age of consent was part of a series of cases we took, but then was followed by gays in the military, which we won, another case on gross indecency, ADT, which we also won. So there was a whole swathe of cases that fundamentally changed the position of lesbians and gay men. And I would like tonight to really thank two people. First of all, Peter Duffy. I don't know, Helena, if you knew
Yes,
Peter.
I did know him very well. He was a wonderful man.
He was an absolutely wonderful man, amazingly intelligent and terribly, terribly nice. And he was our sort of legal guiding light for many of these cases. He had a profound knowledge of European law, and he could clearly see a way in which the courts could be guided to the sort of conclusions we wanted them to draw. So he was amazingly helpful. And I would also mention Stephen Gross from Vinements, who also was a tremendous help and support. Anyway, turning a little bit to the campaign as well as the legal challenges. The campaign was concentrated on Parliament. It was concentrated on trying to persuade MPs. And we did it by getting as many people, as I said, to write to their MPs as possible. And my favourite leaflet was a leaflet, I haven't got it here, unfortunately, but it's, I don't know if any of you remember it, it said, "Heaven, does your MP know you exist?" And what we did, we went to the clubs like Heaven, the gay clubs like Heaven, and the pubs. And we signed people up and then matched them with their MPs and got them writing. And that was obviously in days before mobiles and the internet. And it was time consuming and difficult. In fact, this little pamphlet we sent out, the reason it's this shape is it had to go in an envelope. And we sent out thousands and thousands to our supporters. We also organised demonstrations. We had rallies in Trafalgar Square. There was a Cambridge Union debate that was televised, I think. There were mass meetings at Manchester Town Hall. And of course, we organised the first equality show at the London Palladium. Everybody was there, yes. And we had the Pet Shop Boys singing Go West. And David Norris, the Irish senator who'd campaigned for equality in Ireland. So we did an awful lot. And when it came to the 84 vote, there was a really mass lobby of Parliament. And I remember with Edwina Currie walking up and down the lobby outside Parliament. And I remember actually introducing her to Jimmy Somerville. And I don't know who was the more amazed, Jimmy Somerville or Edwina Currie. But anyway, there was a mass lobbies. Leading figures came out in support. The press all were very involved and took up the campaign. I think Ewan, you met the agony aunts, didn't you? Was it you? I think it was Ewan, or perhaps it was all three of you. I can't remember, but we got all the agony aunts led by...
Hugo was big on the agony aunts.
by Marjorie Proops.
Oh, I think it was definitely Ewan, actually, just to jump in. It was definitely Ewan.
Yes, Angela. Good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, anyway, so we really mobilised an awful lot of opinion in favour. And of course, we had the support of the Labour Party. And I first met Tony Blair, I think Chris Smith arranged it. And we talked about the equal age of consent. I think that would have been in 1993. And the first Labour Party conference where Stonewall had a meeting that I was involved with, Tony Blair was the guest speaker. And again, I think he was Shadow Home Secretary at the time, spoke out in favour of an equal age of consent. And in fact, although people didn't predict it, and people said there would be built in the Labour Party were too conservative, culturally conservative, to support an equal age of consent. That proved not to be the case. And indeed, as Tony Blair said, we were able to build a consensus Conservative, Liberal Democrat and Labour, which eventually prevailed. So there are many people to says Jeremy Corbyn's come into the conversation. I can't believe so. There were many people who worked together across different political boundaries for a common cause, and a common cause which was enormously important, not just for us, but I think in making society a fairer and more equal place.
Angela. And one of the questions that has come up on the side is to ask about why you were right there as an important policy advisor. Why did it take until into 2003 or so to get the Section 28 removed?
Well, it was partly because of the way Stonewall sequenced the various law reforms that we were going for. So we began with an equal age of consent because we felt that whilst sexual activity was still criminal for gay men, then it was very difficult to get any other advances. And then partly because so many people in the armed forces came to us and wanted something done, and they were having such a terrible time, really awful treatment, barbaric treatment. We then did gays in the military. So it was a sort of, we didn't immediately turn to Section 28, although obviously Stonewall was founded in in the wake of Section 28.
There's one of the interventions in the chat comes from a woman, a lesbian, who says that she was a police officer back in the time when she was having to deal with prosecuting people on age of consent cases, you know, and how wretched it was, and how the contradictions were so miserable for her to deal with as a police officer expected to police this stuff, and how she's expressing her gratitude that MPs from across the divide actually took this issue up and did use legislation to create the change, and that the change, in fact, that has taken place here has in many ways fed into change in other jurisdictions, because that's one of the ways in which law operates, is that you then can help support other people who are seeking legal change in other jurisdictions by advising how legal change can come about and how you can actually harness law, which is often used for bad purposes, but which can be used for good purposes if you do it right and have the commitment to it. So that she was mentioning how important it was for her.
It was awful. We used to have people called, pretty policemen who used to go out to try and catch gay men. I mean, it really was an appalling situation.
Yeah, no, I did lots of cases in the 70s and 80s, when I was a young lawyer. Where I acted for young gay men who were young, all kinds of gay men, but who were often being adjunct provocateurs, luring them and into activity, and then pouncing on them and arresting them.
Well, Will and Hugo got investigated by the police. I don't know if you said that, you two.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. You see, there's a question here from Cher Horowitz saying, if Section 28 was so horrible, why do we need to wait 5 years? It's so difficult for people who are not involved in legislative processes to understand how hard it is to get to deal with legislation in Parliament, that finding space. I mean, for example, just now we're trying to get the domestic violence bill dealt with in the House of Lords, and getting time for that because of all the other stuff that is a lot of it crap relating to Brexit and so on, and this internal markets bill. You end up having bills that are pushed out, and so even getting started with legislation can sometimes be difficult, and you have to make strategic choices about how you do that.
It takes quite a while. It took from 1993 to 2000 to get an equal age of consent, which you might have thought was fairly simple. But I think we did try and go look at the most oppressive legislation and treatment of lesbians and gay men and try and deal with that, and then move gradually through. And Section 28, Janet Young defeated us again in the House of Lords. So it was not easy.
I can say that as somebody who was in the House of Lords during all that period, and I say to Jeremy Corbyn, who seems to be now watching, I carry the record of having voted more often against my party than anybody else, often on issues to do with civil liberties and to do with the Iraq War and to do with human rights and so on. But I do want to say that this was one where we had to fight absolutely tooth and nail to try and get this change, because the House of Lords was full of homophobes who were revolting in the way that they opposed anything to do with gay rights and sought to stifle any opportunity for change. They hated anything to do with human rights, and that's still around. And if we want to spread human rights around the world, we have to champion it where we see it, and make common cause over these things. And that's how you spread it in the world. That's how you do it. And you do it by cooperating and finding friends and allies on particular things. And as somebody says on the side, what they hear in this evening's discussions is that often it's by finding people on the other side and making common cause that you make the change, and that's what that's how change comes about. So I just want to now move on to Peter Tatchell's with us. Peter, we thought that you were going to be sending in a video, but you're here, I think, aren't you?
I am indeed, and I'm delighted to join you on this historic 50th anniversary of the first ever LGBT plus protest in Britain, which was organised by the Gay Liberation Front and took place in Highbury Fields, North London, against police harassment on this very evening in 1970. We were going to actually go ahead with this celebration, but we were warned by the police today we'd face arrests and huge fines, so decided to postpone it until next week. But this is a very important anniversary as well, the age of consent, and I'm very pleased to be with you. I would just like to say a few points about Tony Blair and the Iraq War, because I think it does need to be addressed. First of all, I oppose the Iraq War, but more than that, I also oppose Tony Blair over the Public Finance Initiative, over the way in which they cracked down on immigrants and refugees, over the way in which faith schools and faith organizations were given privileged access to government. And eventually I resigned from the Labour Party over Tony Blair's rightward drift. But having said that, I think it's also incredibly important that we acknowledge people who are part of progressive social change, even if we totally disagree with other aspects of what they stood for. And that is the way in which all progressive social change has been won throughout history. The Chartists, the suffragettes, the Black Civil Rights Movement, the campaign against the poll tax. It brought together people from all different backgrounds and political persuasions who may not have agreed with each other on many issues, but on these issues were a common cause. And that is the way we do win. And I think it's really important to sink our differences to win human rights and to acknowledge those who have been part of that battle. To those who criticize Tony Blair, I would say it's very easy to throw rocks, and he deserves some rocks, but will you please organize to bring a legal case against Tony Blair in The Hague or the national courts? Don't just criticize, do something. It's all very well to criticize, you need to actually do something. And I would support a legal case against Tony Blair, and I'm sure some of you on this panel would likewise. But that's what I say to the critics. With respect, I respect their position, I understand where they're coming from, I sympathize, but I do think it is right and proper that a Prime Minister who helped bring about this change was able to make a message. So going back to the age of consent, for me it was personal. When I first came to Britain from Australia in 1971, age 19, I was designated as a criminal by the law. Given that the age of consent was then 21, I could have faced 2 years in prison, and my 25-year-old partner, Eugene, could have faced up to 5 years in prison. So for me, the age of consent was personal. And that's what motivated me to support and get involved in the Gay Liberation Front and support its campaign. It's also very important to remember that the Gay Liberation Front organized the first ever LGBT plus march in Britain. The protest in 1970 was a protest. In 1971, in August, the Gay Liberation Front organized the first ever march for LGBT plus rights in Britain, and it was focused on equalizing the age of consent and culminated in a rally in Trafalgar Square. Now, of course, the Gay Liberation Front did not succeed in getting change. Parliament was so hostile in that era. And after GLF's demise in 1974, the main thrust of the campaign was spearheaded by the Campaign for Homosexual Equality. And I want to pay tribute to the members and activists of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality for the great efforts they made in the late 70s and 1980s, often not recognized in our history, but should be. I also want to pay special tribute to some great allies among Labour MPs, most notably Chris Smith, Jeremy Corbyn, Alan Roberts, Tony Benn, Audrey Wise, and a bit later, Dawn Primarolo. They were there asking questions in Parliament. They were there writing letters to ministers when almost no other MPs would do so. So they really deserve a huge amount of credit. But I also want to make a special commendation for a Conservative MP, Robin Squire. That man, he deserves, real honours. He was pretty much a lone voice in the Tory party from 1979 through the 1980s. He stood against his own party. He championed our cause, including an equal age consent. That was an incredibly brave, courageous thing to do. And even though I loathe the Conservatives, I pay full tribute to him and indeed to Edwina Currie. They were on our side when we needed them. Then, of course, what happened in the 1980s, which is very significant for the big battle we're talking about, is that in 1983, a very brave young gay man, Richard Desmond, took the first ever case to the European Court of Human Rights to seek the court's jurisdiction that the equal age of consent should be made law in Britain. Sadly, the court ruled that the age of consent was a matter for individual parliaments, and it was not prepared to give a ruling. But Richard deserves to be remembered as one of the great pioneers of that era. When Outrage was formed in 1990, one of our key campaigns was around the age of consent. And many of you will remember that we organized young gay and bisexual men to stage kiss-ins, and even in some cases to sign declarations that they had broken the age of consent laws and challenged the police to arrest them. And they went to places like Charing Cross Police Station, Bow Street Police Station, and handed themselves in to try and put the police on the spot. Now, this was part of a much bigger, broader, well thought out outrage strategy. A lot of what we did was criticized at the time as media stunts, but we had a very, very clear rationale. We understood that we first of all had to raise public awareness about the scale of discrimination against LGBT+ people, and in particular, the unequal age of consent. Writing a letter to a member of parliament doesn't do that. So our protests were designed to get media coverage, get on the news, in order to raise awareness about age of consent inequality. And then through that, to get on radio phone-in programs, to get on TV chat shows, again, to argue with our critics, to show why they were wrong, and to build a public momentum for change. And of course, also to put MPs and Parliament and the government on the spot, to let them know there was a movement to secure an equal age of consent. And I would say that Outrage, Stonewall, and many others, our cumulative collective effort was very successful in changing hearts and minds, because by the early to mid 1990s, public opinion polls were showing that a majority of the public supported an equal age of consent. So Outrage, and I'm sure Stonewall, went to members of parliament and said, look, the public is on side. You can have the confidence to legislate equality because this policy of equalizing the age of consent has majority public support. So that was incredibly important. I mean, I think if I to sort of describe things in this way, Outrage was sort of the suffragettes and Stonewall was sort of the suffragists. Stonewall was not our enemy. They were allies working in a different way. And sometimes we did have disagreements, but that's fine. But it was good cop, bad cop. They were the insiders doing the necessary parliamentary work, absolutely vital, just like Millicent Fawcett did it for women's suffrage. And we were on the outside like Emmeline Christabel and Sylvia Pankhurst, rattling the cages of the establishment. I think it worked. I think it worked very, very well. I think, you know, it did help give Stonewall a place at the table, because Stonewall could go to government and say, look, you don't want to deal with those nasty outrage people.
No, we never
talk
said
to
that.
us.
We never said that.
No, I'm sure you didn't, but yeah, you know what I'm trying to say. But that, I'm sure that's the way a lot of politicians and government thought. And since you've interjected, Angela, I do want to pay tribute to the magnificent work you did over many, many years.
Yeah.
Without you, we wouldn't have been there. So
Yeah.
I'm all in favour of defending direct action, but I want to
to
defend Stonewall and Angela as well, because it was a twin track policy and both were very, very necessary.
Peter, that's one of the things that I think is important to bring through, is that so often, you know, there's the business about activism and how it has to push the edge and push it right to the boundaries, and to do all those things like the you were describing, and I acted for people who were involved in some of those actions. And then, of course, a rather kind of different thing that happens in Parliament, and it's the bringing together of those two things that really can create the change, and has been so important on different fronts. I'm having to watch my time here, so that I wanted you to have a chance of dealing with something that's on the sidebar, and it is that a suggestion is being made. And you'll probably know this, because I suspect that when challenges are made to people that have been made before. There's suggestions being made here by somebody who calls himself David but hasn't got a surname. And he's criticising you, Peter Tatchell. He says, for promoting Islamophobia and making life difficult for gay Muslims. Do you make life difficult for gay Muslims?
Outrage, myself and Outrage were the first LGBT organisation to support the struggle of LGBT Muslims. We have literally over the years helped get asylum for not dozens, but probably in excess of 200 LGBT plus Muslims who fled persecution in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh. I have worked with Muslim organizations all over these years. This is sadly the kind of slur and smear that some on the left do make, but my record stands, and people will know that I have championed against anti-Muslim prejudice, that I have stood up against it for decades, long before it was a popular thing to do.
And I can vouch for the fact that I have on occasions worked with you, and I know the support that you give on the work that we're trying to do to decriminalise so many of the laws that were introduced under colonialism when Britain introduced those laws in parts of the world. So it would really be helpful sometimes if people knew more about what people do. I'm now going to, do you mind, Peter? I'm going to have to move this on because I'm mindful of the many different people we've got lined up to speak. Chris Smith. Chris, you've joined us. You came in, I know it, because you couldn't come in until after 7. Would you like to come in and tell us about your experiences of trying to change legislation and to get this onto the statute?
Well, thank you very much, Helena. And just on the topic that we've just been touching on about the lives of gay Muslims, I would like to pay particular tribute to Wahid Ali, who for quite a long time was the only openly gay member of the House of Lords. Through all the battles that happened in the House of Lords on the equal age of consent, and was a very proud voice as a gay Muslim man, a very proud voice in support of LGBT equality. I think we would have had an even more difficult task in the House of Lords if Wahid had not been there. I'm very pleased to say he is no longer the only openly gay, openly LGBT person in the House of Lords. We are making progress. I just really wanted to reflect a little bit on a couple of things. One, the fact that when I first came out publicly as the first openly gay MP, this was back in 1984, things were not easy for anyone in any walk of life who was openly LGBT in those days. Things changed a lot over the subsequent 15 to 20 years. And I think one of the reasons things changed a lot was the campaigning that both Outrage and Stonewall did through all of that period. We needed both of them, both the making of a public fuss and the hard graft of drafting legislation and lobbying MPs and lobbying governments and getting change done. But in many ways, much more important even than that was the fact that social attitudes changed as well. Because gradually people all around the country began to realize that there were people in their family, in their neighborhood, in their workplace who were LGBT, and they were perfectly normal people, and they were lovely people, and they were making a wonderful contribution to life and to happiness. And suddenly people began, instead of fearing difference, they began to like difference. And that change in a lot of how people across society were thinking enabled the political changes that then came following on from that. I think public figures, I hope public figures helped to play a role in steering those changes in society. I'm sure that outrage and Stonewall helped to play a role in changing those attitudes in society, but it was those attitudes that then enabled the fundamental changes that happened in the period from 97 through to 2007, 2008 and beyond to take place. I do want to say also a word about when we came into government in 1997. For those of us who were really pushing for making progress on LGBT equality, the age of consent was the very first thing that we wanted to try and achieve. There were lots of other things we wanted to try and achieve, and indeed did over time. Getting rid of Section 28, getting equal access to goods and services, sorting out the diplomatic service, the armed services, and so on, and then getting civil partnerships, and beyond that, equal marriage. But the first thing on the agenda was the age of consent, because there had already been a real struggle in the years leading up to 97. The attempt to get an equal age of consent in the House of Commons, which we failed at. We got the very quarter-hearted move from the age of consent for gay men coming down from 21 to 18. This wasn't equality, we wanted equality, and so this was very much the first thing on the agenda. And I have to say there was, in those early days, 97, 98, there was quite a bit of nervousness in amongst the political advisors in Number 10 about oh, how is this going to play politically? And one of the really wonderful things that the case that was taken to the European Court in Strasbourg enabled to happen was that then the political nervousness had cover, it had protection. We should have been doing it anyway. I don't think the nervousness was justified, but nonetheless, the fact that the case was taken to Strasbourg meant that we were able to make the case to government. Let's push this through. Let's use the Parliament Act. Let's make sure that we get this onto the statute book. We don't allow the House of Lords to stand in our way. And of course, once we got an equal age of consent established, the political roof didn't fall in. There wasn't a huge backlash from non-LGBT people around the country. Voters weren't upset. Actually, they were rather pleased that this had happened because it was making people happy and content with who they were and what they were. And as a result, after that, the rest became much easier. And so I do want to pay particular tribute to those three very brave people who took the case to Strasbourg, who got the judgment out of Strasbourg, and that broke the logjam for everything else. And we were able over time to achieve an awful lot. I've often observed that these things go on a spectrum. You start with people having fear and as a result hatred and prejudice. It's a fundamental fear of people being different. But then it moves to something that you could possibly describe as tolerance. And then it moves much better than that. It moves to something that you could possibly call acceptance. And then the ultimate destination that we still haven't reached in this country, and I want us to reach at some point, you get to celebration. And that move from fear and hatred through to tolerance, through to acceptance, through to celebration, we are still on that journey. But I think we've moved an awful long way along that spectrum. And it's thanks to many of the people that you see on this screen tonight. Thank you.
Chris, thank you. And can I just say that Matthew Davis, who's one of our attendees, is saying that he remembers going to rugby when he was a student, and Chris Smith coming out at a public meeting there. And it was a brave and wonderful thing to do. And he said, I was in the closet at that meeting and it made a real difference to him. Rebecca Trowler, a Queen's Counsel, a great lawyer, is just saying, I can remember well sitting at the fire at Greenham Common in 1984 and hearing the news about Chris coming out, and it was an extraordinary moment of affirmation. And so it's really important that we do remember those moments that make the change and the contributions that different people make to them. Now, I'm just looking at my the next piece of tonight's events is to bring together Ewan and Will. Ewan first. This was the great case that made the change and that Angela was speaking about, but and Hugo mentioned it earlier on when they were these lovely teenagers who just decided they were going to make the difference. Can Ewan, can you kind of come on and tell us about how you got involved, why you did it, what you felt about it, how it all was.
Thank you ever so much. I actually was one of the people that responded to a press piece in Gay Times that Stonewall asked people to go off and see your MP. And I trotted down at the age of 16 to the East Dulwich surgery of Tessa Jow, having booked an appointment, and asked to speak to her about the age of consent. I think she first thought I was talking about age concern for gay men. And then following the directions in the Stonewall piece, I phoned the office to report back my conversation with this Labour backbencher. And the office phone, I think the last person in the office that Friday afternoon was the press officer, Roger.
Oh, yeah.
Who offered to put me on the database, probably some abacus device, to keep me up to date with the campaign. And I didn't fit into any of the age categories you had. And so I think he invited me up to Greycoat Place and quizzically asked me questions about background and did I know much about the campaign, and was being invited to take part in, I think, a small piece with Ian McKellen and Neil Kinnock the following week on Westminster Bridge. Were my parents supportive? Would I be okay? Was I at school or college? What would my Saturday job think? And I remember standing on Westminster Bridge in my terrible suit, Neil Kinnock bumming a cigarette off me and making sure his secretary couldn't see. And then thought that would be it. And then it kind of steamrolled into being involved in the press campaign and debates about the age of consent, meeting Edwina, who was a great advocate, and then subsequently being involved in one of the European court cases. And I remember the bitter disappointment being in the gallery for the debate in 1994 and equality not being achieved. Absolutely devastated. But the prospect of continuing involvement with the European Court and having the wonderful input with Angela and Stephen Grosser-Bowman and partners and with Peter Duffy. And I remember his kindness. I remember that evening where you two must have been beavering away, Angela, on the case. I don't remember that. I remember me and my dad mooching around Strasbourg and then meeting you both to go to Peter's favourite restaurant in Strasbourg and having a rather lovely dinner before the case the next day. But it was, I can appreciate now with much better clarity all of those tactics, the yin and the yang between Peter's outrage and Stonewall, the reasons why having Labour pursue it through the House of Lords repeatedly was more advantageous than, particularly at that time, and even now, the European Court or a European institution imposing it here. But I had confidence with Angela and Peter Duffy about the decisions that were being made. It took a lot longer than I think we all wanted. But that snowballing of what's happened in society since, the fact that my husband and I are civilly partnered for 10 years, that he's the beneficiary to my NHS pension, that he's my next of kin when I was very unwell some years ago, that we're now foster dads together. We haven't tried the divorce yet, but we've got access to it. But one thing leads to another, and it unblocks, as Chris said, that logjam. The society didn't stop. Society became better and more stable. But I look over at what's happened in the last few years in American politics and what's happened here in Britain. These things can be undone. Yeah. It does not take as much as we think before our hard-fought wins are unpicked. And I hope that the ability to build consensus, to share a platform, find common ground, improves with time. But thank you very much.
Ewan, thank you. That was wonderful. You played a vital role in this change. It was, and Will Parry, come on in and tell it from your experience.
Hello there. Well, I mean, it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces from the campaign here this evening, albeit very sadly virtually. And I mean, I'd just like to basically echo what Ewan's just said and what Peter said, Angela, in fact, what Chris, what so many people have said on the panel tonight. We get most done when we work together and when people from different political backgrounds, different opinions all come together with a similar goal. It's the most effective way of doing things, you know, putting differences to one side and focusing on one key goal. It seems incredible that it's 20 years since equalisation, nearly 27 since Ralph, Hugo and I took our case to Europe. It really seems just the blink of an eye. Angela's mentioned our first meeting. I've got vivid memories of visiting the old Stonewall offices in Greycoat Place with Hugo. At the time, he was 18, I was 23. We knew Stonewall were looking for a young gay man to take the government to the European Court of Human Rights, but neither of us had any idea that they also hoped to take a couple. I mean, I just went along to learn how I could sort of help volunteer and help stuff envelopes. As you'll all know, unlike its heterosexual counterpart, the gay male age of consent also criminalized the younger partner. Now you're about to watch an 8-minute cut down of a video diary documentary that Hugo and I made for Channel 4 about the campaign. From writing a letter, it really was that long ago that we actually sort of, you know, we put a letter in the postal box pitching the idea to getting it commissioned and being paired with a producer took the grand total of 3 weeks. Now, I've worked in TV since then, and I certainly didn't appreciate at the time both the speed of Channel 4's response and their open-ended commitment to the project. They certainly had no idea that our case would culminate only a year or so later in the 1994 parliamentary vote on the amendment tabled by Edwina. I was apprehensive about the consequences of the campaign, though not nearly as apprehensive as my mum. Were we at personal risk? Apparently not. We were assured very clearly that this was just a test case. But as the publicity increased, the distinction became a bit less clear. One night we were queer bashed in Edinburgh, and Hugo ended up in hospital. But the reality that this might be a lot more than a test case really struck home thanks to a certain Dr. Adrian Rogers. Now, I don't know if members of the panel remember him, but he was the founder of the Conservative Family Association and fond of describing homosexuality as sterile, disease-ridden, and God-forsaken. Sorry, I'm just going to move my cat, who is in the way. So he shared his hometown of Exeter with Hugo, and during a Radio 4 debate show broadcast live from the city, he called for our arrest live on air. And there was a policeman on the panel to discuss completely unrelated issues. And he, needless to say, failed to humour Dr. Rogers. I think his words were, "I've got real criminals to investigate." Rogers wasn't having that. He escalated the matter to the Crown Prosecution Service and demanded legal action. In the clip coming up, you see our legal advice before being interviewed. You see us attending the police station. What you don't see is the police interview where, with naive idealism that must have made Angela and our solicitor Simon Wood inwardly facepalm, I made it very clear to the police that, yes, our relationship was definitely sexual. Thankfully, the Crown Prosecution Service had more sense. Prosecution wasn't in the public interest. But it's sobering to think that if they'd decided otherwise, Adrian Rogers' zealotry could well have resulted in both Hugo and I being convicted sex offenders. There are few more satisfying election results than Ben Bradshaw beating Dr. Rogers to become MP for Exeter in 1997. While we were waiting to discover if we were going to be prosecuted, Hugo and I travelled to Russia. He was a language student at the time. And Article 121 of their penal code had just been repealed, leading, of course, to sadly misplaced hopes of social liberalisation. We interviewed gay rights and HIV activists and spent a spectacularly memorable night in a gay club run by the mafia and housed in a bomb shelter in a distant St. Petersburg suburb. Once inside, the doors were locked until 6 a.m. A 70s flashing dance floor blazed while the speakers blared, and I'm not making this up, Boney M's Rasputin. A gay nightclub miles from central St. Petersburg, its clientele locked in, the security provided by local mafia. What made me think that this was a good venue to try filming undercover? I blame, needless to say, the vodka. Footage shows a very drunken, very inexperienced director hiding a large camera in a bag with lens clearly protruding and saying, "I'm concealing the bag in the camera." I wasn't Stacey Dooley. It only took a couple of minutes for the bouncers to rumble what was happening and for me to discover they were armed. I owe the fact that I escaped with limbs intact and Channel 4's camera unscathed to the diplomatic efforts of one of the local activists we'd been filming with earlier. And I remain, needless to say, deeply grateful to him. Over 200 hours of footage was shot. At that time, I had no idea how little it's possible to get into a 50-minute documentary. The rest lies somewhere in a Channel 4 storage facility, hopefully useful to future historians of the fight for gay legal equality. The night of the vote remains one of my most powerful memories. The sadness caused by the death of Derek Jarman just days earlier, mixing with the huge crowd's certainty we were fighting an unjust law, and the ultimate incredulity and anger that Parliament still felt the need for a compromise age of 18. One that thankfully only lasted until the next government. Thinking back over the campaign has brought to mind a comment made by the late Douglas Slater in the hectic final run-up to the parliamentary vote. I paraphrase, but the gist of it was, we'll all remember this for the rest of our lives, but only fully realise its importance when a generation of gay men and women grow up without any awareness of legal oppression. It's only now, 20 years later, more than 20 years later, that I'm fully appreciating the truth of that. As I said, it's hugely gratifying to see so many of you here. Enjoy the clip and thank you all. It was a very, very memorable campaign and I'm so proud to have played a part in it.
In March 1993, myself and my boyfriend Hugo Greenhalgh joined the campaign to equalise the gay age of consent and began to record our experiences. At the time, we saw our journey ending at the European Court of Human Rights 5 years later.
I'm sick of being worried about, walking past police cars whilst holding a hand with my boyfriend. I remember having my first argument with my first boyfriend over the very same issue, because I was like, well, why not? And I don't care about it, quite frankly. I think the age of consent is wrong.
In 1993, Stonewall conducted a survey on the effects of the age of consent. They discovered that 78% of gay men had had sex before 21. 58% would still be criminals if the law was 18. 82% had no sex education relating to their sexuality, and only 2.5% of gay men had been given any safer sex information at school.
Hugo Greenhalgh, William Parry and Ralph Wilde are applying to the European Court for Human Rights in the hope that they will receive there more understanding and justice than they get in their own country because of our age of consent laws. Stonewall's aim is to establish equality under the law for lesbians and gay men in the United Kingdom. We lobby for an equal age of consent, and we will be enthusiastically and vigorously supporting this application.
It is not actually what the correct age of consent is. It is whether the age of consent should be different. It's whether the age of consent should discriminate. It's whether the age of consent should say that you divide sexuality into two different types and treat one type differently from another. It seems to me that there is no rational basis for doing so at all. I appreciate the fact that there is an absence of a rational basis doesn't mean to say that Parliament won't do it.
What we probably should do is just run through what will happen when the police question you. And Simon's just read your affidavits and so knows what exactly has been said in those affidavits.
You know the police are planning to question you and you've consented to be questioned. You don't have to consent to be questioned. You don't have to help the police with their inquiries, but probably in the circumstances you had because they could arrest you. You have a right to silence. That is a right not to incriminate yourself. You don't have to say anything at all. And in these particular circumstances, I would advise you to say nothing.
Do you think if we were to say we are having a sexual relationship and just leave it at that, and if they ask any more questions, say, no comment, that's none of your business?
At the end of the day, the decision has to be yours. Yeah. It can't be anything else. No one can make the decision for you, and no one should make the decision for you.
To a certain extent, I think it's out of our hands anyway. If they want a prosecution, they're going to sort of go ahead with it in whatever form.
I think they're treating it as a serious investigation, so I should think, I don't
know exactly, but I've had several telephone calls with them. They've been in touch with the BBC, they've been in correspondence with the BBC, they've spent time listening to the tape of the Radio 4 bus stop programme.
Can I have the two gentlemen and the two solicitors, please, and the representatives?
Should I come along?
Yeah, try, come through.
Yes.
Bye, guys.
See you later, hopefully.
Some MPs are talking about a compromise of 18. That is totally unacceptable. 18 is discrimination, and discrimination is an affront to human rights. The only law reform worth having is full legal equality. Young gay men don't exist. If you're 16, 17, 18, 19 or 20 and gay, then you're not here. Well, I'm here and we're here, and we will not keep quiet until we get equality.
What is it at the moment? It's 21. What do we want? Not 20, not 19.
Not 18, not 17, but 16!
This is an historic debate. It is the first time in over a quarter of a century that the age of consent for homosexuals has been discussed in this House. The taboo of silence, which has denied the sexuality of young gay men, has been decisively broken. It is no longer a minority issue, but one of human rights which touch us all.
There's a minute silence at 8 o'clock for Derek Jarman. Pass it round.
The United Kingdom is likely to have to change its law before much longer. Last year, 3 young men, Will Parry, Hugo Greenhalgh and Ralph Wilde, announced that they were going to take their case on equality to the European Court. Surely it is better to change our law here, in the House of Commons on a free vote, than to be forced to conform, possibly in an election year.
What my honourable friend is seeking to do is to get this House to vote to legalise the buggery of adolescent males. Does she really think that that's what our constituents have sent us here to do?
No. Our constituents send us here with our brains intact, and we should be using them. How can we advise young gay men about the dangers of AIDS when what they're doing is supposed to be strictly against the law? It is time to take the dark shadow and turn it into a human being. It is time to seize our homophobic instincts and chuck them on the scrap heap of history where they belong. We have the choice to vote for equal rights under the law, for the same law for everyone. The time has come. I beg to move.
So the noes have it. 16. It's not 16. 16 is lost. How do you know? They've just had the vote. The vote just happened. 16 has not happened. They're going to now vote on 18. We've lost 16. We lost
'Bill, It was fantastic, and the sidebar says just how fantastic it was. There's a wonderful message from David who says, "This documentary changed my life." He said, I think he said he just turned 18. He was living in a small village, and it was the first time I'd seen anything about being gay. And shortly after, I wrote to Stonewall, took up the phone, and then volunteered to Greycoat Place to work that summer. And I'm sure that story is repeated by many people about how influential this film was in making people feel empowered and that they had to make the change. It was great.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful and very moving to hear.
And people saying so inspirational. Wonderful, wonderful. Go on. Thank you for sending that message to Will. It was fabulous. And so I'm going to invite in some of the people whose questions are here. I'm just going to put them to people. Daryl Bullock's asking a question, which is, sorry, I'll turn to Daryl later, but this is one where does the debate, this is Ben Butterworth, does the debate around trans people today and their supposed threat to the sanity of the world replicate the arguments against LGBT people in Section 28 and unequal age of consent? Is this fear, angst about trans that's being expressed in any way replicating that? Who would like to answer?
I would say absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
The way in which trans people are being demonized as a threat to straight people, in particular trans women as a threat to non-trans women, replicate exactly the kind of feverish fears and anxieties and demonization that was subjected to LG and B people decades ago. It is truly monstrous. And I always say to these people, just because a handful of Muslims, unrepresentative, commit acts of terrorism, that is no excuse to demonize the Muslim community. We should never, ever do that. And these people, of course, say, oh, no, I'd never do that. But then I say to them, why do you do that to trans people? On the basis of a handful of trans people may have done bad things, but that is, they are unrepresentative. They're a tiny minority. They do not represent the trans community. To penalize the whole trans community on the basis of what a handful of people might do, that is totally and absolutely unjustified.
Anyone else want to come in on that? Angela?
I think that's basically right. I mean, certainly the demonization of the other is what happened to lesbians and gays, and it's happened to transgendered people as well. The problem we have now is the debate around it is extraordinarily toxic. And although in our day, debating issues like the equal age of consent, there were very sort of strong and often very unpleasant views. I think there was still more space for discussion than we have now. And that also, I think, has to be addressed.
I want to tease out something that is in the sidebar, which is about the fact that this is an all-white panel.
Yeah.
And of course, it was dealing with a historic moment. And it's a question really for those of you who were particularly active in the LGBTI communities. But I mean, were there as many Black voices? I mean, what we know is about intersectionality is that multiple experiences of discrimination can actually be even more oppressive, and therefore, if you were Black and gay, it may be that it was even harder to come out and to be an activist and a participant if that was particularly problematic in your own community. I mean, it was hard enough. It's hard enough for anybody back in that time to be declaring their sexuality. What I mean, we're looking at this historically, and I wasn't involved in the planning of the meeting, but were there many minority people involved in the campaigns back then? And can we can you give us a sort of indication of that? Because it feeds into this suggestion, this business of there's a comment made on the sidebar from a young Muslim man who's gay and who says that he has to cover himself in anonymity because it's so much harder for someone in his community. And so it's, you know, when I was saying people shouldn't make comments when they're being under the, you know, without declaring their name, I mean, he was pointing out that that is particularly hard for people who are experiencing that kind of discrimination. Angela, would you like to comment?
Well,
on...
I think our movement we were particularly involved in was largely white. I think that is true, and it, you know, that affects it, and it was, I mean, it was certainly not exclusively so, and the work we did around immigration involved people of many different ethnicities and from many different countries all over the world. So it wasn't exclusively so, but it was so. And I think just now we have to be very thankful for movements like Black Lives Matter, which I think will transform lesbian, gay, LGBT movement as it's transforming other sections of society. So, I mean, that's absolutely to be welcomed.
Peter, you might want to say something about this, or Chris, about that period where it was essentially a white campaign. Is that your recollection at the time? And has that greatly changed now? And what about the problems that there are with the whole kind of business of multiple discriminations, adding to the pain of being someone who is finding it almost impossible to come out because of their circumstances?
Well, that is true. Outrage had quite a number of Black and Muslim supporters and campaigners in our group, but almost none of them were willing to be public because they feared the consequences from their families and communities. And I'll give you just one example. One very brave 19-year-old gay Muslim man joined one of the outrage protests in favor of an age of consent outside Parliament. He was recognized on TV by family members. They came to his house, kidnapped him at knife point, took him, blindfolded him, took him to a location that he doesn't even to this day know where it was, where he was bound to a chair and held for over a week. And he was burned with cigarettes until he agreed to stop being gay and to marry a cousin. Now, when he was eventually released, he said, "This is why my fellow LGBT plus Muslims who support this campaign won't get involved, because we fear, or they fear, what happened to me will happen to them." Outrage had 3 Muslim affairs spokespersons during its lifetime. All of them were hounded out by a combination of far-right extremists and left-wing trolls. They were also speaking out against Islamism, the political ideology which seeks to impose a theocratic dictatorship. They opposed various organizations in Britain who were anti-woman and anti-LGBT. For that, they were denounced as turncoats and as Islamophobes. One of them ended up having a nervous breakdown. That was the atmosphere in which we were operating. We tried to give these people platforms, and we did, but they were hounded out. And I just think about all this criticism online about Iraq. When Outrage helped Ali Hilli form Iraqi LGBT way back in 2003, just after the Western invasion, he got no help from any mainstream LGBT group or any left-wing group or any women's group anywhere. We were denounced as colluding with the Iraq war. We weren't doing that. We were trying to defend LGBT plus people. And Ali Hilli is another great hero who deserves recognition. He helped save hundreds of LGBT plus people from Islamist death squads in Iraq in the period after the invasion. And both he and I were totally opposed to that war, but we did actually do practical things rather than just shouting our mouths off to actually help LGBT plus Muslims.
Peter, it's why you're a hero to so many people who know about your human rights work, and not just here in the UK, internationally.
Well, hang on, I'm not a hero, but I just really resent it when people say we didn't do these things, that we didn't care, that we turned our backs on LGBT plus Muslims. That is just an absolute travesty of the truth.
I think that is true.
Yeah.
I mean, I should say, I mean, people like Ian had very strong connections with South Africa and the Black gay South African movement, and we obviously consistently supported those struggles. And it was ironic that South Africa, was ahead of this country for many years in respect of lesbian and gay rights, with fundamental rights guaranteed in their constitution.
Listen, the police arrests of gay men were for cottaging and all that business. There were black men as well as white men.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Can I
Chris,
just add
please.
one comment? And I think one of the things that was happening was that police were particularly targeting black gay men at that time, and that emphasizes the point about double discrimination that many people of color were facing. It was at the time a predominantly white campaign to achieve the equality in the age of consent. I think that if it were happening now, it would not be, because society has moved on an awful lot in the intervening time. And actually, you can see that in the campaigns now for trans rights. A much broader spectrum of people involved in those now than was the case 20 years ago.
I just wanted to also mention, I mean, there are lots of people who are basically, Peter, not allowing you to say that you're not a hero, like it or not. There are people who think you are. But Jane Ozanne, who's listening in, says, wants to make a point that, not all deeply religious people are anti-gay. And she makes the point that not all evangelicals believe that it's sinful to be gay. There are a growing number of us, she says, working with the LGBTI community, and she says, of course, it does bring the clash of rights that so often happen around rights, freedom of religion and freedom of other rights so often clash. And she says, surely one of the overriding principles must be do no harm, and harm now. I mean, we're talking about the horrible misery and wretchedness that people's lives are made of people's lives because they're not allowed to be who they are. I mean, it's so important. Now, I wanted to also bring in something came up on my computer, and it's got nothing to do with this at all. It's to do with some bill in the House of Lords. Anyway, Chris May is asking the panelists, surely education has an important part to play in forwarding the notion of equality, and really pointing out that ignorance is no excuse for bigotry. And that everybody, whether trans or people of color, differing religious beliefs and all of that, can all make contributions to a better society. What we need to be doing is making better coalitions, because if there's a lesson out of tonight, it is that change was made possible by coalitions from very different places. I mean, just listening to the speech in the film with Edwina in Parliament, addressing some of the real hostile voices in our own party, but they existed in the Labour Party as well, and they existed in across the House, and so grinding that down and working away at it has been so important. How do we do that as we go forward, and how do we maintain that to prevent any backlash?
Well, we do have to do it because there are still ongoing issues. I mean, we were talking about conflicts between the Muslim community and the gay community. It exists now in education, actually.
Yeah.
And there was I mean, I deal with education now in my borough in Camden, and there were some very sincerely held views that the new regulations on relationship education, which include dealing with gay relationships and gay lesbians and gay people, are wrong. And parents don't like it, and they don't want their children to hear about it, and so on. And you just have to keep talking. And you just have to continue to try and be as respectful, I think, as you possibly can. So, I mean, you were talking about no platforming earlier. I mean, I think my experience is not talking is not good.
No, I agree.
And talking is better.
Thank you.
And it's very difficult often, and but that's what you have to do if you're really committed to trying to achieve change together.
I'm now going, oh, sorry, Chris, I was going to, we're running out of time, and I wanted to bring in our final contributor, Naomi Wolf, who is taking part from the United States. And Naomi, you're there, and you've heard this debate, and I just I hope that you'll come in and tell us what you make of it all. You've been a great champion of equality, and you've written extensively on these issues.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me now? Am I successfully unmuted?
Yes, you're successfully unmuted. It's great to see you.
I mean, I'm so honored to be participating with actual living heroes who have, among a relatively small group, changed history for all of us for the better, and to witness this in our own lifetimes. And I think I probably am having the same feelings many people in the audience, you know, listening and participating are having, of just being awed and humbled that a small group of people, including teenagers and, you know, very young men who have nothing really but their own convictions, and maybe a parent or a friend supporting them, managed to come together with each other and with, you know, people across your country and ultimately across the world to really change history. And I did prepare a little something at the request of one of the conveners, which I'd like to share. And before I dive in, it'll be brief, but I just wanted to say, I want to express my thanks to all of you as a mom of two young people who are the ages that some of you were when you began this journey to change history for other young people. And my kids benefit directly, you know, even though we live in another country. All this activism affects laws around the world, and it's an extraordinarily better world because of what you've done. And I also really am happy to be joining this community as speaking as a feminist, because something that really scares me, and I come at it at the end of this little talk I prepared, it frightens me a lot to witness, almost, I would say, speaking as a political consultant, because you all have been so successful, undemonizing gay men and lesbians and bisexuals. What I see is that the right wing has moved on to demonize trans women in particular in a very, very cynical way. I can get to this later if you like, but I feel like it's incumbent on all feminists, because it's being done in our name, which is super sneaky of the right wing, to speak up and say, not in my name. You know, now more than ever, especially because they've created such a toxic debate around trans rights in Britain. It's really important for feminists of all sexualities and genders to stand up and say no. So anyway, let me jump right in if I may. And thank you so much for inviting me. As I said, British law and citizen activism are powerful influencers around the world, and your activism in changing unequal laws has inspired many in other countries, including my own. So I want to speak briefly about the issue of the age of consent, not in legal terms, you all have done that so beautifully, and I'm not a lawyer or a legal historian, but rather as a feminist cultural critic. And I want to talk about how the legal age of consent acts as a metaphor in bearing cultural codes. So ages of consent, of course, should always have the neutral, equitable, and important function of protecting children from adult predators. But the reality, and the last, you know, almost 2 hours have really demonstrated that, eloquently, is that what should be this neutral, equitable function of protecting children has also often been used as a social metaphor to communicate values and norms that have nothing to do with the well-being or equitable protection of children. So an unequal age of consent for gay male, as opposed to heterosexual sex acts by older teenagers, was codified and discussed in Britain until 20 years ago in ways that communicated a powerful message to young people in Britain. And you've all, spoken so powerfully to this, but it's one that I am afraid I'm also old enough to remember. And like all homophobic law, it had a cultural function as well as a legal one. And it set the message to everyone that some sex, that is between young men and young women, was more licit and acceptable, and other sex, that is between young men, was more shameful and unspeakable, even with all else being exactly equal. So the age of consent at different times, these laws have been used by cultural gatekeepers to send messages about who is protected and who isn't, and from who can make decisions about his or her own body and who may not do so, what kinds of sexual activity are, quote, dangerous, even if these acts are between people who would otherwise be considered mature, and even if these acts are consensual. And, I wasn't in the front lines like all of you were, but I was a witness at times to this history that you are making, because I was a graduate student in Oxford in the 1980s. And I won't ever forget hearing a male student who may have been 19 or 20 describing how in his life, he and his gay friends had had to hide their relationships and sexual lives and make contact with each other in a state of fear, even as their older teenage straight friends of the exact same ages did not have to do so. And I was so struck by this at the time because I was pretty young then myself, and older adolescents' love and sexuality are hard enough to manage for any older teenager. And this student's narrative showed that that actual fear of derailing his future added a layer of tension and anxiety, and these words are of course not adequate to the pain this caused, to the ordinary developmental challenges of simply growing up and learning how to manage love and sexuality. I was shocked by this, as well I was well aware at that time of the fight for LGBTQ rights in my own country as well as in Britain. I had never heard of a differential in the age of consent for gay versus straight sex acts by young people at that time. And being so close to that age at that time and surrounded in college by 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old undergraduates, I was well aware that gay older teens were no more or less mature than were straight older teens, and indeed had exactly comparable issues to deal with in growing up, to address rather in growing up, different issues to deal with, of course, legally. I was really moved by how this criminalization of my fellow students' very recent experience communicated to him the message that burdened him, that something was innately existentially wrong with emotional and sexual relationships that everyone around me who was straight had been having since their later teens, as a matter of course. Heterosexual older teenage relationships were celebrated in countless movies about first love, in countless scenes about initiation after the high school prom, in countless pop songs like "Oh, What a Night" that celebrated an older teen's heterosexual initiation. By an older woman, by the way, songs that were played on top 40 radio stations. And straight listeners to what I'm describing should imagine that not only did gay older teens have none of this mainstream cultural affirmation, which so movingly me, again, as a mom, is, we're hearing from people who were young at the time that amazing clip we just saw was aired, and what a difference that made to them. A little bit of cultural affirmation meant so much. But these teenagers, older teenagers, also had to worry about the law while trying to simply grow up as complete human beings. So I knew gay and lesbian students, bisexual students in Oxford 30 years ago. And I know undergraduates at British universities now who identify as members of the LGBTQ+ community. And the change in these laws that you created has not had a trivial effect. Growing up without the shadow of criminalization over their young adult sex lives has allowed this generation to be more secure, more free, and to have a great deal more energy to devote to their studies and their communities, as they don't have to devote energy to hiding their older teenage experiences or struggling with divided consciousness caused by having to conceal such important parts of their autobiographies, which goes to why this fight isn't just a fight that affects LGBTQ people, it affects everybody, because the love and the self-acceptance that is blocked by such censorious laws stops so much good communication and love and building and contribution from flowing freely to the communities around the people who are harmed by these laws. So what I was asked to bring up briefly is a really interesting difference in British age of consent laws that you all have described and lived through and changed for gay versus straight older teenagers in Britain, with how the British state had managed ages of consent for girls in the 19th century. And I wanted to recall the campaign of the first wave of feminists in the 19th century, led by such activists as Josephine Butler, to raise the age of consent for girls. So while this may seem superficially to be two different campaigns, fights by very different groups with different goals, I think that what unites them is that in both cases, marginalized or silenced groups were resisting a state that wished to manage the bodies of young girls in one case and the bodies of gay male youths in another, in ways that projected corrupt and irrational social views about sexuality onto these groups, and that denied the agency and the lived experiences of members of both of these groups. What's erased from much, sorry?
So that's such an interesting reflection on the way in which, on the one hand, of course, there was the business of the younger that women were, the better, and then on the other hand, that it was to be prohibited for men. But in both senses, it's controlling. I'm going to have to draw you to a conclusion. We've run over our time,
Sure.
Naomi. But
if we've run over time, I will zip ahead to my conclusion and share it verbally, which is that basically, in both cases, even though they seem to be very different examples, the state was saying to girls in the 19th century, heterosexual girls were trafficked in large numbers in the 19th century to heterosexual adult men. So the state was saying to heterosexual adult men, there's nothing you could do to these girls that could harm them with your sexuality. Their consent or lack of consent is meaningless over the age of 10 or over the age of 13 or over the age of finally 16. And by the same token, by collapsing consensual sex between adult men into categories of violence, like indecent assault, which was, how these offenses were lumped together in the 19th century, as Graham Robb and other scholars points out, it communicates the message that there can't be consenting sex between adult men because, or young adult men certainly, because violence is kind of baked into the concept of sex between consenting young adult men. So, and that is, the essence of homophobia, as Graham Robb points out. So that was just to conclude that these messages have really deep impacts on young people, obviously, and that I think that the phobia that the British and the American state have, and I brought up the example of 8 of 10 of the books that are censored in America that the ALA keeps track of have to do with showing, and many of you brought this up, positive images of same-sex love and relationships to young adult readers. I don't think it's because gatekeepers think that young people will be traumatized by these experiences or by this content. I think it's because they're afraid they won't be traumatized. And yet censorship has done nothing to, get rid of a single young gay reader, a single young lesbian reader, bisexual reader, or trans reader, or get rid of an iota of love or human relationships. So now's the time more than ever to redouble our efforts against censorship of same-sex relationships and love, and against, I would say, deplatforming, because that keeps us from having wonderful debates like these or discussions like these. And I ended with saying, it's more important than ever to support trans people who are being demonized in the way that my mentor, Professor Paul Johnson, who wrote really an important book about going to Strasbourg and who showcases the work of Hugo Greenhalgh and his colleagues. He said that he believes trans people are being singled out in the ways that gay and lesbian people used to be and still are at times in Britain, and that this is a clear and present danger to everyone. So
Naomi, thank you. And it's a reminder, actually, that we're talking about the way in which patriarchy across all of our lives has controlled our sexuality, has controlled our bodies, and how we have to be collaborative in the way that we confront that. I want to just mention that Daryl Bullock had sent in a message earlier on, and he said, isn't it just a statement of fact that the UK's LGBTI community owes a huge debt to those who did this work back then? And he says thank you to all of the people that Naomi has just thanked too, who helped to basically make the change for LGBT people, and who made it possible to no longer be a second-class citizen. And he's speaking for lots of the people who really would be here tonight if they hadn't been sort of persuaded not to participate because Tony Blair was saying something at the beginning. It's such a shame, because this is so important, and it's also about understanding how to make change in society, and about how it is about collaborations that do it. Naomi, thank you for giving us a letter from America. It's always great hearing from you, and keep at it. I want to thank everybody who participated tonight. It was really a wonderful, wonderful panel. I want to thank each and every one of you. We've had a great deal of interesting stuff on the sidebar, lots of interesting contributions from people who quite clearly have assumed names, since I suggested that anonymity wasn't good. So we've had Tony Blair participating in the sidebar. We've had Jeremy Corbyn participating. We've had all manner of people, including Santa Claus. Anyway, all I want to say is we are so lucky that we've had such wonderful campaigners, wonderful people involved in making the change, and long may it go on. And we have to make sure that we resist any backlash. So thank you all. It was a great celebration.
Thank you,
Helena. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Very inspired.
Thank you.